This is The Common Denominator, and I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. Welcome back to The Common Denominator. We are sitting today with Professor Richard Landes. Richard Landes is a historian living in Jerusalem. His work focuses on apocalyptic and millennial beliefs at the turn of the first and second millennium, 1200 CE. His books on these topics include The Apocalyptic Year 1000, Heaven on Earth, The Varieties of the Millennial Experience, and his book on 2000 CE, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Lethal Journalism, Anti-Semitism, and Global Jihad, which just came out in 2022. It's been described by just one reviewer as the book that saw 710 coming a mile away. He coined the term Pallywood in 2003 while investigating the Muhammad al-Dura affair and maintains a blog critical of Western journalism, The Augean Stables. Professor Landes' book, Can the Whole World Be Wrong?, is proving to read more like prophecy in light of the invasion and barbaric massacre of October 7th and the tidal wave of unhinged Jew hate, which we experience with mouths agape, as it takes on a life of its own and seems to up the ante daily. But it wasn't prophecy, it was direct observation and research that led to the writing. The book documents the inability of Westerners to understand the medieval mentality that drives global jihad. It's prompted a series of disastrous misinterpretations and misguided reactions that have contributed fundamentally to the ever-worsening moral and empirical disorientations of the mainstream media. The press reports Palestinian and Jihadi war propaganda as if official news, which fuels the distrust and deepens splits within their own Western countries, weakening the ability of democracies to defend themselves. The book cites the example of former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, who rejected Israel's denial that it had committed a massacre in Jenin in 2002. Quote, "I don't think the whole world, including the friends of the Israeli government and people, can be wrong," said Annan. In the book, Landes asks, could the whole world be wrong? And his answer is a resounding yes. Ours is a world of inversion, where among many, the events that the Jewish people, the Israeli people, experience collectively are robbed from us in broad daylight and used against us in accusation. It's a terrifying phenomenon to witness, not only because it is that which we most cherish and value at sobering and dire risk, but it's seeing the breakdown of people's ability to observe objective reality. Events that happened in time do not require a membership to any side, for they are recorded history. Collectively witnessed events are being denied, finger in each ear, and the implications of this can hardly be quantified. Words have not lost their meaning so much as their meaning has been targeted, hijacked, and corrupted. People have been so thoroughly abused, perhaps by fear and algorithm, for one, and we can discuss this, that forensics, CCTV, and repeated verified testimonies do nothing to sway one towards even consideration of an alternative perspective, while simultaneously the most absurd and brazen displays of fake videos and stats are reposted and spread instantaneously. What can be plainly observed is that no one seems to be telling the truth. Yes, media, both legacy and new, offers something of the technical fact. But the facts on offer are handed over to the public, removed from time and location, creating perhaps the greatest lie of omission on a global scale. Acts of violence are reported upon, which had no pretext before, no context during, nor larger picture after. The lens focuses solely on the punches thrown by one side alone, fabricating the impression, as Bob Dylan himself noted some time ago, of Israel as a neighborhood bully. So utterly convinced are people of what Israel would do, it takes no pains to check whether it really has done. This phenomenon on wash and repeat has actively and deliberately fueled the delegitimization of Israel, which leads to the dehumanization of the Jews, which leads, God forbid, to the larger attempts of genocide of our nation once again. Professor Landes, there are several directions your research can take us in this discussion. But in the time we have, I want to cover the most critical aspects which you believe are necessary for people's understanding and action today, in the framework of our world with an Israel that can be invaded, and historical structures of shared reality and relationships in fast deterioration. Perhaps it's most effective to simply ask you what I imagine is a 2-in-1 answer, and that is that in light of our reality after October 7th, deep in a hot war, and no less a viciously lethal war of words, can you tell us, where are you holding? What are you thinking? What was it you saw on the way when you wrote "Can the Whole World Be Wrong?" and how, if at all, your thinking has changed in these 6 agonizing months since?
Well, that's a big question. Let me answer the last question first, which is I'm just more worried. You would have thought, I mean, there was this, I thought, phony human rights discourse that the Palestinians were producing about how their movement was about dignity and freedom and human rights and so on. And they were able to sort of succor, in my view, the progressives in the West to side with them against the bully. But with 710, you saw the ferocity of the hatred. You saw an aspect of the Palestinian movement that anybody who visits either Memory or Palestinian Media Watch is well aware of, but which our media has completely blocked out. And here you had it for real, and you had the response both of the PA, the moderate PA in the West Bank, and even worse, the sort of BDS human rights movement in the West cheering it on. And so at that point, you would have expected the sort of progressives who had been duped to pull back. And what's striking is really I'm unaware of too many non-Jewish progressives who have pulled back. I'm aware of Jews who are very far on the left who sort of stopped. Even some members of B'Tselem, but not B'Tselem itself, which doubled down. But in any case, what should have been an aha moment has turned into doubling down, which I got to say happened in 2000, which is where my book focuses on, Arafat throughout the 90s in Arabic saying this is Treaty of Hudaybiyah, it's an Oslo, it's a Trojan horse. This is, as far as we're concerned, land for peace. But in fact, it's really land for us. It's land for war. And the peacemakers doubled down and insisted that if only Israel had given a little more, we were so close and so on. So I'm familiar with the phenomenon of doubling down, particularly as a student of apocalyptic expectations, in which people who are disappointed with the prophecies of their leaders actually double down on the prophecies and in many cases get worse, turn from sort of enthusiastic belief that all this will happen organically into a kind of coercive mode in which you literally carve out the perfect world on the body social, which is what we saw both in Nazi Germany and in communist Russia and China and Cambodia. But I got to say, I thought there was more character in Western progressive thought than there was. I mean, back around 2000, Michael Walzer wrote a piece on the indecent left. Well, 710 revealed that the indecent left is by far the majority of the left, and that includes a whole bunch of journalists. So I would say, if anything, my attitudes when I wrote the book have doubled down in response to the doubling down of those people. I'm not sure I got to all the questions you wanted, but that's my initial response.
So basically, in light of seeing your book come off the pages into 3D, it's now real concern. It's what's next, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do we? So let's go back. Let's leave us worried, because I'm also incredibly alarmed, and I'm even more alarmed hearing that you are as well, because of many things I've heard you say, which is, I think that Jews across the spectrum really did rely on the built-in human empathy, human ability to recognize truth,
Right.
And I think it's been, while anti-Semitism is not shocking, it's the scale. And for me, it was the flip a switch overnight aspect that has been
Yeah.
like, we're doing this again?
Yeah.
We're really doing, and now we're doing it with 8 billion, a phone in 8 billion hands. And
Right.
so I really am curious to discuss it because I come from it with the point of view of the effect of cell phones and this sort of invasive technology and the algorithms that prey on your weaknesses and your vulnerabilities and all the dirty little secrets of things you like and you hate, which I think have made this a global scale threat to the Jews, which is, obviously people have talked about, we talk about IBM and what they did for Hitler's Germany. So now with these cell phones, this is what, those dictators only dreamed of.
All right.
I,
So
yeah.
actually, let me start by discussing one of the key concepts of my book and why the original subtitle of the book was A Medievalist's Guide to the 21st Century. And essentially, what it was as a medievalist, I'm studying people who have a profoundly different mentality from the one that I grew up in the post World War II West, in which liberal and progressive ideas weren't weirdo millenarian notions that only a few crazy people had, but really the consensus of the society. Whereas in the Middle Ages, this is a society in which things like honor violence, that is, you insult me, I either really damage you or kill you. I wash my blackened face, I bleach my blackened face in the blood of my enemies, um, in which honor violence is taken for granted, in which people's responses are deeply, shall we say, predicated on peer group pressure. It's a profoundly different mindset about what's acceptable, what's normal, what's expected from the one that we have. And what I realized was, the Arab world is still in that mindset. And we, as Westerners, are somehow inextricably committed to a kind of liberal cognitive egocentrism in which we project onto them what our values are. And the whole narrative that the Palestinians have been selling the West, which is we accept the two-state solution, we're renouncing our claim on 78% of historic Palestine, and we're settling for 22%, and it's the Israelis with their settlements, and Abbas is ready for peace, and the Israelis. All of this is pitched at Western notions of cognitive egocentrism, because Westerners can't imagine that there is a people who openly preach genocidal hatreds, invoke, I think Obama and the Pope both said, no religion calls for the killing of innocent people. They are invoking their religion to call for literally the genocide of every last Jew. And, the Nazis actually basically, it was an open secret, but they certainly never acknowledged that they were committing genocide. There was no word for it yet, but they never acknowledged that they were literally exterminating the Jewish people. Here you have from the pulpit, carried on TV, carried through cell phones, etc., through all the new media, these calls for genocide, and the West can't believe it. And if you say to them, this is what's going on, they say you're a racist. They don't say, let me see what there is. I remember I'm on my class list, class of 71, and it's full of these people. And I wrote and I said, please go visit Palestinian Media Watch and report back what you see. And you know what they did? They went and they found the one section of Palestinian Media Watch which is trying to be optimistic and giving the rare case of genuinely moderate Palestinians and saying, well, there's that. Yeah, there's that, but they're not the ones who are calling the shots. So you end up with this situation where Westerners are so easily duped. It's an interesting thing. It's a kind of virtue signaling in which I would never think so badly of the Arab people and the Palestinian people as to believe the kind of stuff you're saying about them. and this is the real trap, which you will appreciate. The the twist there is, I don't accept what you're saying about the Palestinians, but I do accept what the Palestinians are saying about you. You got these leftists who would, heaven forbid, I should ever think a terrible thing about the Palestinians, engaging in a Palestinian discourse which constantly demonizes Israel. And just to go to the media for a second, because that's what I, to some extent, worked on and still work on reluctantly, but nonetheless do, is that, the media will put these people on. So they'll put these people on, and these people will just carry on saying the most disgusting things about Israel with virtually no pushback. And if there is pushback, it's so light that, you really you gotta reach for it. And then when they respond with more vitriol about Israel, they just let it go. So you've got a media, CNN, BBC, France 24, New York Times, you name it. You've got a NBC, MSNBC. You have a media which is constantly mainstreaming these lethal narratives about Israel. And the only people that consult on the Israeli side are either the rightist wing government spokesman they can get, or left-wing Israelis that consult people who affirm the Palestinian narrative. So, you got, and again, this gets back at this key element of the difference between the medieval or pre-modern mentality and the modern mentality, which is the modern mentality expects people, when appropriate, to be self-critical. And the Israelis not only are self-critical, but as one commentator noted, the worst thing you can do is admit to things that you haven't done. And yet that's exactly what Israel is willing to do. That's what they did with Muhammad Adura and so on. So you've got this situation in which the Israelis are hyper self-critical. The Palestinians are hyper non-self-critical, and in fact constantly scapegoating Israel. And you got an outside listener listening and saying, well, 50% of Israelis say it's their fault, 100% of Palestinians say it's Israel's fault. That means 75 to 25, it's Israel's fault. So you have an idea of why the original title of my book was They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid. But my daughters told me I couldn't use that because I was insulting my reader. And I said, even though I say we, and they said, you're not fooling anybody. So, but there really is a profound stupidity at the highest levels of intelligence about the Palestinian cause, more broadly, because the Palestinian cause is just the local manifestation of global jihad, about global jihad. There's a total denial on the part of the West. I remember when I was teaching at BU, I had assigned Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. This is after 2000, after 9/11, so he was proven right. And yet I asked a colleague if she had a copy so that I could consult it, and she said, I wouldn't have that book on my shelf, right? So the attitude is, we're not at war with these people. In fact, if anything, anybody who says we're at war with them is contributing to the belligerence. And like in the 1990s, a guy I went to college with, one of my oldest friends, Dan Pipes, comes to visit me. We're talking about various things. And he says, I said, what are you working on? He said, I'm working on the effort of the Muslim, I forget which term he used for those Muslims, Islamists maybe. I use triumphalist Muslims who believe that their religion has to dominate in order for it to be the true religion. In any case, he said, they want to invade the West. They want the flag of Islam flying from the White House. They want the Queen of England to wear a burqa and stuff. And my initial response was, that's absurd. That's ridiculous. But then I thought, look, I study millennial beliefs. This is a millennial belief. This is, world conquest. So on the one hand, you have this world conquest. It may strike us as ridiculous. It doesn't mean that they don't think that they can do it, even if they can't. But worse, one of the basic rules of millennial studies is wrong, which all millennial movements are wrong. They up until present, they have not perfected the world or brought about the perfection of the world. Wrong does not mean inconsequential, right? Hitler's millennial reign, Tausendjährige Reich, only lasted 12 years, but look what he did in those 12 years. So what I think happened, however, I mean, Dan Pipes alerted me to it. David Cook, who now teaches at Rice and wrote a book on apocalyptic beliefs, contemporary Muslim apocalyptic beliefs, alerted me to it. Steve Emerson alerted me to it. So all these people alerted me to it. I don't think any of us who saw it coming had any idea that the West would be so feckless in its response. And that's the really disturbing aspect of 710, which is the fecklessness is at this point so deeply embedded in the administrative apparatus of the West that there are no breaks. So have I sufficiently depressed you?
I'm almost there. Wait, a few more questions. There's a couple questions I have out of what you just said. I want to talk more about this idea about the sort of stupidity, because certainly it's hard not to come to that conclusion, but also the other side, which also feels like just too much of a sweeping generalization, which is it just rooted in anti-Semitism?
Right.
Because you mentioned Scotland, right now, or yesterday, 2 days ago, they made a law that if you call a man in a skirt a man and not a woman, so you can go to jail. Meantime, Hamas officials can go on to Sky News and say we committed a genocidal massacre and we plan to do it again and again and again. So you have these two blatant where
Right.
you can't even speak obvious objective truth on
Right.
one hand. What are we to do with it?
All right. Just as an aside, I got to say, since the Scots wear skirts, the men wear skirts, it seems like the strangest place
Fair
in the
point.
world legislation, but okay, we'll let that pass. But you already had this in 2003. After the Jenin massacre, the main mosque in Sweden was it was airing the Yassin tapes. And this is the Yassin from Hamas, who was the mastermind and the ideological mastermind behind the suicide terror war on Israel that broke out in 2000, 2001. So they were doing this, and the Jews of Sweden complained to the government because there are laws against incitement to hatred. And it came before a judge, and the judge said, this is how they talk in the Middle East. Who are we to get involved? Right? And yet, at the same time, they were imposing laws that arrested people for saying things that were deemed Islamophobic. So this is not new, this madness. It's just, again, it's doubled down. It's insane. So let's get back to the question about anti-Semitism, because I think a lot about that. I'm an American. I'm a faculty brat. I grew up on the two coasts, California, Bay Area, Boston, Cambridge. In my entire life, I don't remember an anti-Semitic incident. A couple of people told me, oh, she did that because you're Jewish, but I didn't even notice it. Okay, so it wasn't like I ever really dealt with anti-Semitism. But in my work on medieval anti-Semitism, I came up with a theory that very often, if you locate an anti-Semitic outbreak like the massacres in the Rhineland in 1096, if you look backward, you'll find that there's a previous period of Philo-Judaism. And looking at the Philo-Judaism, this was in the 1990s, looking at the Philo-Judaism of Christian fundamentalists who were pro-Zionist and were trying literally to produce a red heifer so that we could start sacrifices and rebuild the temple. But if you looked at the Philo-Judaism of the Christians, it was clearly connected with apocalyptic expectations. They expected the rapture in the year 2000. It didn't happen. I thought in the 90s that it wouldn't happen. I was right about that. But I also thought that they might then fall into the same pattern that Christians had in the past, which is when they're enthusiastic and optimistic and in a generous mood because they believe Jesus is about to come back, they're very friendly to the Jews. Even Luther was initially very friendly to the Jews because they expect them to convert. And then when they don't convert, they blame the Jewish refusal to convert on the delay in the coming of the end. And then you get really nasty stuff. And I thought that might happen. And I spoke to a number of people about it. And they all literally laughed at me. I won't name names because they're people I respect otherwise. But they all laughed at me. Okay, so I was right about 2000. I was wrong about who. And to be honest, I think that if Barak had succeeded in getting Arafat to say yes and had literally given back the Temple Mount to the Palestinians, then maybe the right wing Christians would have turned against a secular Israel. But instead, what happened was that Arafat refused. The Muslims went into full-fledged apocalyptic mode. This was an apocalyptic war they were waging against Israel. And the left was the one that turned. And although I had been aware that there were lots of sort of what I call soft millennial expectations on the left, there was a big movement for what was it called, Amnesty 2000, that all dead around the world would be forgiven in the year 2000 and stuff. And there was lots of apocalyptic expectation around the Oslo peace process. When they were disappointed, they turned on Israel. And they turned really ferociously. And the Muhammad Adura story is sort of the first successful blood libel against Israel, successful in the West since the end of the Second World War. And since then, it's become a regular feature of journalism and so on, like the Jenin massacre. So on the one hand, I was right about the anti-Semitism was in 2000. I was wrong about where it was going to come from. But once I understood where it came from, I tried to talk to people about it. And I found that I had two problems. With the Jews, very often people would say, of course, Esav soned et Yaakov, or le Yaakov. And that's, Esau hates Jacob, and it's in the genes, and there's nothing to do about it. And then on the Gentile side, I came up against this, don't be ridiculous, this is just legitimate criticism of Israel. And it's got nothing to do with anti-Semitism. And part of what I was trying to communicate was, look, there's a famous quip that has been attributed to Isaiah Berlin, but I haven't found it, which is that the definition of anti-Semitism is hating Jews more than absolutely necessary. And this is this was around the time of the Second World War. So, but the quip of the 21st century is anti-Semitism is hating Jews even though it's killing you. Because the West is committing suicide in adopting this absurd narrative about Israel committing genocide against the Palestinians. They've literally got the story totally inverted. It is entirely to their disadvantage. Any leftist who thinks that when the left and the jihadis succeed in bringing down America, which is what we're hearing calls for, Intifada USA, bring down the American government and so on, if they think that they're going to have a place in the sun in this new world, they need to study what happened to the communists in 1979 when they cooperated with Khomeini in kicking out the Shah. They were next. The idea that infidels think that if they side with the Muslims against the Jews, that's going to get the Muslims to view them favorably is just insanity. And yet it's an insanity that has literally locked on to current Western perceptions.
I mean, obviously, to the point that we have no borders. We have this suicidal immigration policy or lack
Right.
thereof. Is that do you still attribute to this sort of, I mean, the commitment to ideology is more important than the results of it. You said it so perfectly. It became more important to look good than to actually accomplish anything, which there it is. So is that still this doubling, this refusal to see to the point that they're willing to destroy civilization itself?
Well, first of all, they don't think they're doing that. Are they capable of doing this until it's too late? Yes. Will they? I hope not, but I gotta say, my optimism is not very great. But it seems to me we're dealing with three different things here. We're dealing with, it's a form of anti-Semitism that I call moral schadenfreude. It's a form of supersessionism in which I feel good about myself because you're down there. So the Christians are the first to come up with the supersessionism. Our moral values are so much greater, higher, more elevated than the Jews. The Jews really, they're no longer relevant. They're the unchosen people. And it's a very deeply zero-sum notion of chosenness. In order for us Christians to be chosen, the Jews have to be unchosen. So there's built into that mentality what my father always warned me against, Zichrono livracha, you don't make yourself look bigger by making other people look smaller. And yet that is exactly the appeal to progressives in the West about news of Jews behaving badly. They love it. They eat it up because they're on the moral high ground and the Jews are down there. And on the one hand, you've got this apparently insatiable appetite for news of Jews behaving badly, which says a lot of bad things about the, shall we say, psychological stability of the progressives, that they need this in order to feel good about themselves. Then you have the problem, and I'm particularly aware of this because I study the journalists who are here, and that is the problem of intimidation. In other words, you can tell the nastiest crap about Israel you want, and unless you're factually incorrect, Israel's not going to make a stink. But if you start saying things that Hamas doesn't like, you're in serious trouble, particularly if you're trying to report from Gaza, which was the case up until the current case. And even now there are people going in and reporting from Gaza. And they're entirely what I call Palestinian media protocols compliant. They do it the way the Palestinians and Hamas wants it, which is the vast majority of people are women and children. The Israelis are deliberately targeting innocents, blah, blah, blah. Okay. We've done two things. One, the moral schadenfreude. Two, the intimidation by the Palestinians. And then three is the fig leaf. And the fig leaf is the moral, the virtue signaling, the post-colonial, I'm for the underdog ideology, which covers the two previous and not very attractive motivations for telling this story. And with the three together, you really have a sort of self-sustaining dynamic that we have to break. And to be honest, I don't know how to do that. I will admit that I'm much better at understanding what's going on than doing something effective about it.
I don't think that it's hard to imagine what does being effective even mean. Certainly speaking the truth. I think that's a big cure in and of itself. But if it only reaches the brief margins and the noise that's drowning it out, I mean 90% of the dialogue out there is this complete anti-truth dialogue. I mean, there's nothing to even give people the havamina, even the indication that there might be anything to argue against. I mean, right. Barring a little bit of curiosity in a Google search, which would in a second set somebody straight, at least, still yet. But there's no reason to even look for it. So I it's like it's this sort of algorithm glass ceiling where you see these accounts on Twitter and other apps that have 500,000, 1 million and more followers, whereas right. people sort of trying to reporting have got, a few single thousands at best. So I think that
I mean, Elder of Zion's got hundreds of thousands of hits and stuff. Look, I mean, a couple of things. One is It's well known amongst shepherds that if you're taking the sheep out for, the summer, so you're going to be roaming the mountains and the hills for the summer. What you want with you is about 10% of the flock should be goats. And if there's a lightning and thunder, if there's a rock fall, if there's a wild beast or whatever, the sheep will look to the goats. If the goats are calm, they are calm. So the goats ground them. And essentially what we need is goats. The problem is people are looking, it's like they're stupid sheep who are looking to other sheep for guidance, and they're
So,
ignoring the goats. In fact, they've been warned off paying attention to the goats, which very
yes.
often are the Jews. And so you've got this situation in which people literally believe. I mean, you look at these people who do whatever they do, whether it's tearing down posters of Chatufim or chaining themselves or throwing, and this is even relevant to us, but throwing paint on the Mona Lisa or whatever, they really believe they're doing the right thing. My father also said, sincerity is the cheapest of virtues. They're sincere, but, they're suicidally sincere. It's, to answer your question, what would be effective? What would be effective is if, for example, Muslims couldn't use the term Islamophobia to shut up anybody who's critical. Ilhan Omar would have to take serious criticism instead of saying Islamophobia, Islamophobia, and everybody back down. There is a cognitive war campaign. This is a cognitive war campaign they're waging against us. It's an invasive one, which is kind of amazing because in cognitive war, the purpose is to get your much more powerful enemy not to use their power. Now, normally, the Maccabees kick the Greeks out, the Vietnamese kick the Americans, the French and the Americans out, whatever. But an invasive cognitive where you're actually invading somebody's territory and want them to stand down. And when I first described that to people, I said, well, that's ridiculous. Nobody would do that. And they'd say, that's what Islam is doing. And we're letting them. And they go, oh, that. So there's a cognitive war going on. They're winning hands down. They've been winning for the last 25 years.
They so clearly have.
It's cognitive war in response. The only problem is we don't seem to have the will. The Israelis are the ones who should be doing it, but the Israelis are so focused on defending themselves that they consider the cognitive war, that's for girls.
Do you really think that? Because that has been the biggest question, because our truths really sit so large. Everybody has to walk around them to piece together some other theories. Why doesn't Israel do a better job of Hasbara? They recently got rid of Elon Levy. It's not the point. Anyone who can speak and articulate, you can
Right.
pick anyone.
Right.
Why aren't we ever addressing? Why are we not saying again and again, we're not fighting the Palestinians, we are fighting Hamas, because Hamas will turn into Hezbollah, and Hezbollah. I mean, why aren't we saying these words
We
on
are, and
repeat,
people aren't
clear and
listening.
simple?
We are, and people aren't listening. I mean, I had this conversation with a woman at the Israeli consulate in Paris in 2003. And I said, what's going on? How come we're not responding? She said, we are. Nobody wants to hear what we have to say. So it seems to me that in some senses, we have to do more than just put out the right version of what's happening. It's got to be more than that. You've got to analyze your enemy's attacks, analyze his strengths and his weaknesses, and go for those weaknesses. And one of the things that Jews in general have a problem doing is bad-mouthing other people. I mean, ironically, we're the people who's the most bad-mouthed in history, and we're the people who least want to bad-mouth other people. I mean, I remember when I was the Hillel advisor at BU, there was apartheid week, and I said, let's do an anti-apartheid week. And they said, no, let's do an Israel day and we'll serve hummus, which of course was then viewed as right. But the point is they just want to be nice. And we can't afford to be nice, and we don't know how to do it. And to be honest, me too. I mean, I work with a guy, and he keeps saying, "Be nasty," and I say, "Well, I don't feel, but yeah, nasty." But we got to counterattack, and to do that, takes some strategic thinking. I'm not a strategic thinker. I'm not, I've been saying this for at least a decade, more. I mean, I had a student who did a thesis on cognitive warfare back in 2008. So since then, I've been talking about cognitive warfare, and I haven't made a dent.
I feel like, I'm sure you have seen the excellent Dr. Einat Wilf, and I feel like
Mhm.
she's such a fantastic representative because of her clarity. She
Yeah,
doesn't look right or left. She says it, and she says
right,
it clear, and she says it with a back, spine straight, and I think that that is really the way. The constant apologetics, again, I don't know if we'll have time to get into it, but your talk on the Jewish over self-criticism, which I
right.
laughed heartily, having
Hyper
a living
self-praise.
encompassment of myself.
Right,
And I really think that that is the answer. Just the absolute clarity of knowing that you hold an objective truth. None of us has the whole picture or the whole truth. That's not what we're talking about. There are objective truths. There is black and white. There are events that happen and there are reasons for it. And just like the non-Scottish men in the skirt, like we've got to be really, really clear and say it without apology. As I think that
yeah,
you're right. Americans bend over backwards, Israelis bulldoze, and never there is a middle ground to meet that, I think.
right,
And people appreciate, because I think we are literally it's like TikTok. It's the blind leading the blind. It's history in 30 seconds, which has been grandfathered back to some biased
right.
person's opinions that were put there in the first place. This is what it is, and it's terrifying to watch the smug pretension that people spit out these facts out of history and time. It's incredible. Even just yesterday I went on I won't even go there, but some large platform thinker in Scotland who is calling for military action against Israel. There's zero mention that the hospital of this whole battle that there's any Hamas there.
Right,
This idea that we just showed up just to be
right.
cruel, it's so
Yeah, yeah,
absurd.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
absurd. If you just had to think on it, which I guess we could just go into the whole Pallywood, which, if I haven't said it already, one of the main goals of this podcast is to take back our language, because the language used vastly in the media is inherent bias, inherent guilt. And what I see that you've been doing for decades is the attempts to teach the new language of what the Jewish Israeli perspective is, which is vastly different. And it's never been told, Aleph Taf from A to Z. So Pallywood is what you coined 20 years ago. And I'm going to already ask the second question, because boy, do we see it today. I mean, I look at these videos going around and they're so blatantly fiction in every sense. There's not a single logical part of what's happening in the video. Of course, that it's believed instantly. What I want to ask is, of course, you can describe this Pallywood and where you think it's arrived to today, where we have technology, but why the theater? There's objectively, surely there are people in Gaza who are suffering, real suffering, real suffering. Why the mockery of it?
That's a really good question, because I remember when I first came up with Pallywood. Now, in a second, I'll describe how that happened. But when I first came up with Pallywood, one of the responses of people was, there is enough suffering. They don't have to make this stuff up. So why would they make it up? Okay, so we'll come back to that. Let me briefly tell you how I came across Pallywood. I was investigating the story of Muhammad Abdullah, this 12-year-old boy who was allegedly shot behind a barrel on September 30th, 2000. And it was right after Sharon visited the Temple Mount. That was Thursday. Friday, there were riots. This happened on that Friday. And it went up immediately without any checks. The France 2 TV went with Charles Anderlin, who was a Jewish Ole from France who served in Dover Tzahal and so on. And he published it and said that the boy was the target of fire coming from the Israeli position, for which he had no support whatsoever. He had no evidence whatsoever. When he was later asked about it in an interview in Haaretz in Hebrew, which didn't get translated, this section didn't get translated, he said, what would they say in Gaza if I didn't say the Israelis had targeted him? As if he's taking directions from Gaza? Apparently, yes. Okay, so I'm looking into it, and I'm working with this guy, Nachum Shachaf, who was the first person to sort of investigate. And one of the things he did during his investigation was to get 2 hours of a Reuters cameraman who was down there that day taking pictures. And, you look at 2 hours and about when it isn't kids standing around throwing rocks or, lighting fires to tires, it's fakes. It's about, I'd say a third, all of the action was fake that day, with a couple of exceptions. I think one person did get killed that day when the Palestinians opened fire on the Israeli position, but the Israelis never left their position, and there are whole scenes going on, and we know where they are, and we know the Israelis are not even in the line of fire, and people are ducking and running, and other people are standing there. It was absurd. So I was aware that the Palestinians did this kind of faking, and then I went to see the footage that Talal Abu Rahmeh took. He's the cameraman who took the alleged murder of Mohammed Adua. So I'm looking at the footage with Charles Ondela and with one of his Israeli cameraman who was with him in Ramallah the day this thing happened. And it's just fake after fake. And there was one that was just ridiculous, where a guy faked and nobody came, and he was limping, and then he just looks around, realizes nobody's coming, and walks away. And the Israeli cameraman left. And I said, "What do you left?" He said, "Because it seems like fake." And I said, "Yeah, all these things seem like fakes." And I turned to Ondela, and I said, "Oh yeah, they do that. It's a cultural thing." So aside from his Orientalism, for me, the other shoe dropped. In other words, it wasn't just that the Palestinian cameraman faked it. It was that the Western media had no problem with this. They used it. Bob Simon used a whole bunch of fake footage in order to tell his version of what happened at Netzarim Junction that day, and so on. So that's when, as I walked out of the office that day, I thought, holy mackerel, this is in the industry. It's Pallywood. And that's why I coined the term. And interestingly enough, I published my documentary. I had never done a documentary. So I published the documentary on Pallywood in 2005. And that summer, maybe it was the summer of 2006, there was a war in Lebanon. Much to my surprise, back in the day, this was big. This is before YouTube. I had 50,000 views of this piece that I put up, which was a lot. Anyway, the people who did it then caught a whole bunch of fakes in Lebanon. So I thought, great, this is going to be sort of, this is going to change the dynamic. Not really. And in fact, what's happened is, you say you see these Pallywood stuff all the time. There have been a succession of articles that I think started in Rolling Stone, but clearly have all the feel of a kind of a campaign of different sites debunking Pallywood. And they always go for the same things that were identified as Pallywood and aren't. They never show the stuff that's been identified as Pallywood and is. And essentially, they're motivated, and they literally say it, that people like me are using Pallywood in order to prevent people from sympathizing with the Palestinians. And that's where you've got, you say, why do Pallywood when you've got real suffering and stuff? I'm not entirely sure, but one of the things that I do know is that they are particularly drawn to displaying their grief. And so they take these pictures of people who then, when they know the camera is on them, exaggerate their grief. They may, in fact, be grieving. But you get the sense that this is a show, and it's a show for the West. And if you look at somebody, I think just today posted something about how if we just stopped all the cameras in Gaza, this thing would be over much faster. And you can say, oh, that's because the Israelis are going to go in and wipe everybody out. No, when the Israelis are done, you'll find out, as you did in Jenin, as you did in Oferet Yitzukah, Kastled, as you did in Tzuketan, whatever that one was called in English, that in fact, basically it's at worst a 1-to-1 ratio between civilians and combatants, which is in urban warfare, and particularly urban warfare where the enemy hides and embeds behind their own people. 1 combatant to 3 civilians is the average, and often worse. But what you've got here is this massive campaign on the part of the Palestinians to stop Israel from pursuing Hamas. And they do it in terms of this manipulation of Western compassion. And the Westerners are only too eager to have their compassion manipulated. It's like, so it's successful. So why wouldn't they do it? And, there was a recent piece in The Intercept, which is, they didn't realize what they were letting us know. They thought they were sort of reporting good stuff, whereas I read it and I go, whoa, in which Amanpour and a bunch of journalists were basically yelling at the higher-ups in CNN that they're not letting enough of the Palestinian narrative through, and that they have to hire more Muslim female reporters. Like they've got 3 of them who are systematically pumping the Palestinian suffering narrative into the West 24/7. It's just astonishing the amount of time that CNN and BBC dedicate to showing Palestinian suffering, and they'll do it until they get Israel to stop. Israel can't stop. And so it's a doubly effective thing for the Palestinians. Not only does it slow down the Israeli attack on Hamas, if not stop it, which is one sufficient goal for cognitive warfare to pursue this, but it alienates the entire world from Israel. And so it's a win-win. If the Israelis keep fighting, they keep looking bad. If the Israelis stop fighting, Hamas lives. Again, I think part of the problem is, and I think this is true of Israeli decision makers, is they don't take seriously enough just how terrible this cognitive war is. And then when they do, they figure, oh, we'll take care of this. And they can't, and they don't, and they don't consult people like me who have been fighting it for the last 25 years.
Right. This really seems like the Pallywood that you've described. Tell us how that combines with the lethal journalism. So you're saying the Muhammad al-Dura incident in 2000 was the turning point where this became the norm. This is okay. This works. We got a good formula, right. And 23 years later, it's full.
Right, and anybody who doesn't conform to the formula doesn't last too long in the brotherhood of journalists here. My daughter was in Dover Tzahal, and she said, the journalists often come in with reasonable attitudes about wanting to do a good job in journalism. Within a month, they've joined the other side. And it's either they've joined the other side because of the peer pressure of the seasoned journalists over at the American Colony Hotel, or they felt the bite of Hamas intimidation. So on the one hand, I would say lethal journalism has become the dominant voice, and I define lethal journalism literally as reporting the war propaganda of one side in a foreign dispute as news. And that's what they've been doing. Jenin, over and over and over, it's Palestinian suffering. The violence must stop. And we have to get at the core of the violence. And what do? They turn to the Palestinians who say, stop the occupation. But if you listen to what they say in Arabic, they say, if Israel withdraws to the 67 borders, uproots hundreds of thousands of settlers, and allows the right of return, boom, it'll be finished. So, in Arabic, they're perfectly clear about what they're doing. In English, they use this bullshit human rights argument. And the West, again, combination of moral schadenfreude, intimidation, and moral narcissism, accepts it.
Yeah. I think that it's very clear from whichever profession you come from that the mind is the battleground today. Okay, we're in a hot war, so we've still got that, but the mind is that this is where all the battles waged are being played out. So it is lethal journalism. We are turning if the war stopped today, what we would be contending with for decades to come. And not to mention, it has to be said, this infantilizing of the Palestinians, which it's this Orientalism that you've described, but it's and what actually I was noticing in radical Islam, if you saw that in I'm forgetting where, is it Afghanistan? They just made in Sharia law that they are going to be able to stone women to death. Watching this, everyone is to blame but themselves. It's like, this is what I see radical Islam doing. Everyone is at fault. Women, Israel, infidels, everyone, but there's zero self-reflection. That's it. And I wonder, leading into that, if you want to even just say a few words on, you have Saudi Arabia, who has been, I guess, to some degree battling that radical Islam and that terrorist type of the terrorism that was happening there. Is it that Islam needs a reform? They've never gone through one. Is there any hope from that point of view of that sort of inside battle between Islam? We're watching radical Islam devour Arab countries whole, and watching it take over everything that Iran touches turns to a dark totalitarian mess.
So listen, first of all, I don't think you can expect the people who are committed to the scapegoating narrative, which is also a world conquest narrative, the world will be fine when we run it, from backing off it. So the only thing you can hope for is to have sound minds prevail before real damage is done. And I'm at this point thinking real damage is going to be done. I'm thinking there are European countries that are going to go under, whole sections of European countries that are going to be lost. They have their Gazas as well. And those Gazas are no-go zones, and they may not be as heavily armed as Gaza is, but they are, and they're in the heart of a civil society that doesn't have the protections that Israel has developed in its 100-year experience of fighting triumphalist Islam. But the question about Muslim self-criticism is huge, because now we get back to this question I raised at the beginning about mentalities. The medieval mentality is the medieval mentality of the lords and anybody who was in the world of honor, is one in which self-criticism is weakness. In which, if you admit publicly that you made a mistake, you're dead. In fact, a friend of mine, Elisabeth Moutet, a journalist in France, wrote about Anderlecht and said he can't admit that he was wrong. It would be the end of his career. So, and it should in that case, but the way she put it is, if you admit that you're wrong, it's like bleeding in water with sharks. And that is the public atmosphere in the pre-modern world. So getting the Palestinian leadership, the current Palestinian leadership, to self-criticize, I think, is a lost cause. What we need to do is prepare a leadership that's capable of that kind of thinking. And I mean, I know Arab Muslims and I know Palestinians like Bassem Eid who are capable of that kind of self-criticism, but they're minority figures, and they're not going to win anything. And part of the problem is that, and here's where I blame, if I'm going to scapegoat anybody, or point the finger at anybody, I'll point it at the left. The left should have long ago stopped with this humanitarian racism in which they have no expectations, no moral expectations of the Palestinians, extremely high expectations of the Israelis, and don't even realize what racists they are in not expecting Muslims to level up. And then if you say, these guys are behaving like kids, then you're accused of condescension and, ideological imperialism, whatever. I mean, we even have this problem in medieval history when people try and use those kinds of psychological analyses. So, yeah, it seems to me that the whole world should be literally in the title of my book, the whole world. If the whole world had half a brain, if the whole infidel world had half a brain, they would say to the Muslims and to the Palestinians in particular, no, we're not buying this shit. Learn to live with the Jews. If you can't live with them, you sure as hell won't be able to live with us. You got the best enemies in the world. If you were fighting Arabs, you'd be gone. And here you are fighting the Israelis. They're the most merciful enemies, as Basamid said to me once. We have the worst friends and the best enemies.
So true.
If you learn to live with the Israelis, then, the whole world would be safe. But if you can live with the Israelis, nothing in the world is safe.
That brings me to a really crucial point that I think that I have been trying to make, and I'd love to hear it in your words, which is this idea that this is equal to anti-Jewish or anti-Israel equals anti-American. And what has become extremely clear that what Israel is, what we represent, we are the buffer. We are the buffer between the terror that kicks down your door and your quaint tree-lined streets. And I think it's important, maybe you could describe how that is. It's that I want to say that I feel like Jews in the past, maybe in the Crusades, we were persecuted for our religion. And in the Third Reich, we were persecuted for our genetics, if you will. And now we're being persecuted for what we bring to the world, which is this law and order and justice and civilization, which the beauty of criticizing it and molding it and peeling it and pruning it is exactly the beauty of being able to live in it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is absolutely crucial, and it's got a lot to do with. In my book, I deal with this. I think it's less visible today, but it was really visible in the first decade of the 21st century, which is that a lot of this fed off of anti-Americanism. There's a book by a former colleague of mine, Markovitz, called Uncouth Nation, and it's about anti-Americanism. And one of the things that he has a chapter on anti-Zionism, and he said, when I started this chapter, research for this chapter, I thought, anti-Zionism and anti-Americanism are kissing cousins. No, they're twins. They are, and if you look at the stuff like in 2003, all the demonstrations, anti-war demonstrations that are carrying signs of Saddam Hussein and Yasser Arafat, all the anti-war demonstrations are literally, for them, Bush and Sharon are one and the same. It is, in fact, the most democratic countries in the world which are being targeted. And the other democratic countries, instead of realizing that they're next, are going, I don't mind seeing Israel and the United States look bad. We're the better democracy. So you got Sweden saying, okay, this is how they talk, but don't you dare say anything nasty about them. Sweden, moral Sweden, the cutting edge of moral Europe, committing suicide so that they can preen on imagined moral heights. That gives you a picture, but the real nitty-gritty detail which you're talking about is, I remember a long time ago, back in the early 70s, I was part of a program, a tutoring program for kids who failed their high school year. And I was with the 10th graders, and the 12th graders were in another site. And, the guy who ran the program, I was just a tutor in the program. The guy who ran the program did it with an iron fist. And being a good liberal, I'm thinking, why aren't you being a little nicer and stuff? And then at the end, there was a big ceremony. We all got together, and he said, I want you to come with me. And he took me to the dorm where the 12th graders were. And there were mattresses that had been ripped apart. There were doors that were knocked down. There were windows that were shattered. He said, this is what happens when you lose control. And what Americans don't understand is, they've been living in a situation where since World War II, things have been relatively calm. And they are now allowing the rise of a kind of hostility. They have no idea how bad it is. If Israel were to go under, or if Israel were to be really in very serious danger, and incidentally, that's the scariest thing about 710 was up until 710, the demonstrations and the violence against the demonstrations against Israel and the violence against Jews in the diaspora carried out by Muslims, starting with Muhammad Adua in 2000, were in response to reports of Israel attacking Palestinians. This time, you had reports of Palestinians attacking Jews, which inspired attacks on Jews, right? So that's a very worrisome indicator that there are people who are just waiting for a sign to take to the streets and do damage. And Americans can't believe it. I mean, it occurred to me early, and I was afraid to say it because I didn't want people to think I was a paranoid nut. But, we now have Muslims in America who can be mobilized in a suicide terror war under the right circumstances. And I think, in France, there were riots in 2005. And one of the things that kept the cops from putting down the riots was they were worried that if an image got out of a French Arab who had been killed by the police, they would have what Israel had, which was suicide terror. So they appeased.
You said this somewhere else. It's that liberalism, it's that hope and that investment in liberalism that Jews also hoped would reflect back on them. Maybe
Yeah.
there is this sort of, I'm afraid to put any boundaries on it because I might be on the outside of them.
Right. So, look, it was really interesting when the Jews had their big march on Washington after 710. I remember a cop being interviewed, and he said, "I've never received more thank yous in my life." Right. The difference between a Jewish, Jews love democracy. They love playing by the rules of democracy. I would argue in my work, I argue Jews invented civil society. That's what Judges was. It was an experiment. It didn't work, but it lasted a couple of hundred years and had some pretty nice periods of peace. But the point is, you have a civil society. We're eager to play by those rules. Part of the problem is we succeed too well. Once you say, okay, it's going to be merit, not connections, that gets you advanced, all of a sudden Jews are getting advanced. And that's what alarmed the Nazis. And I think that's what alarmed the 11th century Europeans as well. But the point is that we're the best friends and the best participants in democracy could hope for, except for the crazy ones like these, hyper progressives. But so, but somehow that doesn't stick. There was an interesting, this is in relationship to this recent AP photograph that won the award for the best picture of 2023. So it reminded me of a cartoon that won an award in 2004 from the British Political Cartoon Society, which was a grotesque piece using Goya devouring his children to describe Sharon devouring Palestinian children with Helicite. It was inspired by the Jenin massacre, which wasn't, which was the opposite. And when he was asked why they gave it the award, he said, "Oh, it got so many hits, and the Jewish community was so upset. It was like, how could we avoid it?" And he said, "Well, how come none of your cartoonists do any cartoons of Arafat eating babies?" And he said, "Well, Jews don't do fatwas, do they?" So here you are, and the next year, 2005, was the breakout of the Danish cartoon scandal, where the West showed just what cowards they were. So, you've got, part of the problem as an academic, I can tell you this, is academics really, we're not trained for battle. The ones of us who went to graduate school in the late 60s, early 70s, we got whatever it was called. We didn't get, we got draft, we got whatever it was called, some kind of exemption from the draft. So we don't know what courage is. We want to sit there and write what we want. And if, in order to get, and I heard this from somebody who was a China scholar, if you want to do research in China, you got to say stuff that the Chinese will approve of. And even if it isn't, bootlicking, you certainly aren't going to say some stuff that are going to alienate them.
It's exactly the academia that gives the stamp of approval, of authority and how far back do we go? I was speaking with Isabella Tabarovsky about the influence of Zionism is racism, which was sort of a paid for academia, which began quoting itself till it became a whole body of work. Can you say anything about this? Academia is exactly who has given all the authority, and I'll add on the sentence that you said that it couldn't be more on point, which is that when it comes to the dialogue of Palestine and Israel, you can say anything you want. Everything you can't say anywhere else, you just call it Zionism, and you can say it all.
Right.
Yeah.
So look, I think this story is the story of Edward Said, who, when he started, he was sort of, the sole voice supporting the Palestinian cause, and all the liberals were with Israel. And when he was done, as Ian Buruma put it, without even expecting a dispute about it, said in 2003, it's become a litmus test of liberal credentials. As a liberal, I didn't know there were litmus tests of credentials, but okay, to be on the Palestinian side. And this at the height of the suicide terror campaign. So Edward Said succeeded. And one of the ways that he succeeded, and I've done this in a number of articles, he basically manipulated honor shame and said to the West, when you say bad things about us, you hurt our feelings, you shame us. And that's not nice. It's like, you wouldn't call blacks lazy, so why do you call Arabs belligerent? Well, Arabs are belligerent. So, and the success of Said in turning Middle Eastern studies into a propaganda outlet was huge, and it really showed its value in 2000, because that's when it went from the academy to the journalists to the public.
So, in my more layman's term, would we describe this sort of suspension of all the rules that apply everywhere except when it comes to Israel and the Jews? Can we say it's a combination of inherent bias versus if again, depending on how you see it, either the weakness or the placation, the Jews being an easy target because we don't do fatwas, as well as the terror and fear of the Arab who clearly cannot take criticism mindset. Is this sort of this three-pronged?
It's a failure of intellectual integrity. It's basically the cultural Maginot line of democracy, which is a commitment to telling the truth, whether you like it or not, or whether your audience likes it or not. Failed. It just failed. The first place it collapsed was in France after the Adoura affair. France just, the schools, particularly in the Arab neighborhoods, just flamed up with hostility to Jews, Jewish teachers, the administration in general, and the French just backed off. When Jewish parents said, my kids are being bullied in school, they said, well, maybe you should put them in a Jewish school. And literally within 10 years, all these Jewish kids, even the religious ones who went to public school, switched to Jewish schools, to the point where people who grew up after that had no memory of Jews going to public school in France. So that happened then, and that's what's happened now in the West. There's a collapse of what should be those protections that make modern society possible. So, among other things, you've got a news media that is not only dishonest, but people know it. If half of the public is voting for Donald Trump, part of the reason they're voting for Donald Trump is they know that they're being lied to. They don't trust the media. So here was the media in 2016, New York Times, carrying on about how Trump was disgusting and so on and so forth. And they were convinced that that would convince people not to vote for him. And in fact, what it did was it convinced half of the country to vote for him, precisely because they had enough experience with the New York Times to know that they were not trustworthy. Right. And so, yeah, we're in really serious shape. As Douglas Murray says, if we were to enforce the rules, we could save ourselves. But there's no will to enforce the rules. We have everything we need to save ourselves, and except for the will.
How do we get the will? How do we really, because certainly this hot war that has been a big cold bucket, everything that people are terrified in theory comes home to roost when you have someone literally coming to kill you, right? It's a very...
Look, 7/10 should have been the equivalent of the Nazi invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. At that point, even the frickin' British and French, who were still babbling about peace in our time, woke up and said, whoops, we got that one wrong. Chamberlain, you're out. Churchill, you're in. Okay. I don't know what's going to happen in this election, but even if Trump wins, I can't say I have much faith that he's going to know what to do. He knows how to get people riled. I don't know if he knows what to do, although he did okay with the Abraham Accords. In any case, the point that I'm making is that whatever happens, there's worse coming. So whether it's, a whole chunk of Belgium becoming a de facto Islamic state, the next major catastrophe, the best we can do is prepare people to respond intelligently instead of stupidly, as they did to 7/10, to the next one. Sort of, the joke in the 70s was a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged. For some people, even getting mugged, I mean, what's his name? Robert Fisk. Robert Fisk got mugged and he still said, it's our fault. Thank you for beating me up. But yeah, so at what point will people say, holy shit, our appeasement, our being nice has backfired?
Yeah.
And, I remember talking with a friend after 2000, and he was on the board of, I don't think he's still on the board, but we're no longer friends, so I don't ask him, but he was on the board of B'Tselem, and I said, look, being nice doesn't work. Right. And he said, but I don't know what else to do. That's my only move.
Wow. That's it. The mentality here is of control or be controlled. There's only two options.
Rule or be ruled.
Rule or be ruled. And I see it so clearly, everything that you're saying. I deeply appreciate your thoughts here. And it's very clear that all the people in between there have been we've had the rug pulled out from under us. Our institutions are not what we thought. Our leaders are not. Our countries don't look like what we signed up for. The brochure, is the reality is very different from the brochure. And people are looking for a leader and someone to bring them coherence. And obviously what's abundantly clear is that that's not going to come from outside, because like you said, there on every single occasion that it could have come out from the outside in, October 7th certainly was about the most brutal example, and hope that would have. It's going to have to be this moral clarity and compass from within. I don't see, and so I can only say that the act of speaking truth, of seeking it and trying to have dialogue about it, is right now my only tool. But it seems to me, again, very clear that it's just going to have to come from us. And maybe that's still naive, but, barring from putting faith in God and empowering the human empathy and human experience that we do share, that's my best tools forward for now.
Well, more power to you and to everybody else engaged in this effort.
All right, brilliant.
Right.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And again, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? It's on Amazon. If you're in Israel, you can get it from Pomerantz, any other local bookstores, and
That's what
to
I got.
find you on Augean Staples. Professor Landis, thank you.
Thank you.